Raimond Gaita is Professorial Fellow in Law and Arts at Melbourne University and Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at King's in London. He's also a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. And I am genuinely delighted that we've got Raimond Gaita here with us tonight. He's someone who I've wanted to have coming to speak for the law school for a long time. Now, his title was to have been The Idea of a Common Humanity and the Universality of International Criminal Law. But he tells me he's been rethinking what he's going to talk about. So I actually don't know what he's going to talk about, but I'm quite sure that Raimond Gaita does. So please join me in welcoming him to us.
Well, thank you, David, and I'm very honoured to be here. My talk still fits under that title, but not entirely to the blurb that accompanied the title. And that's because up until even 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, I had 13,000 words, and I had no idea how I was going to cut that without giving a talk that was so dense it just couldn't possibly be described as a public lecture. And so I've turned to something else that I've been reworking, and it fits, I think. But it's an hour still, so but the difficult bit is more or less at the beginning. So, it's about 2 pages of difficult bits. Well, despite my joint appointment to the Law and Humanities at University of Melbourne, I'm not a legal philosopher. In fact, I couldn't even teach a first-year law course. And I've made some maverick forays into law, written on genocide and torture, and to some degree on the idea of a crime against humanity. And I've been interested in what kind of thinking is best suited to understanding the ethical dimensions of these matters. And I've extended to these aspects of legal philosophy thoughts that I developed primarily in moral philosophy about the importance of art to our thinking about morality and the ethical more generally. And my point in doing that has not been merely to say that art can yield to us an imaginative content upon which to reflect. It's been a more radical claim that thinking about some of the critical categories that define whether you think well or badly about art, about what we believe we can learn from art, yields to us a richer conception of discursive thought. And in what follows, I assume that at least some international criminal law, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, for example, now has for us an inexpugnable ethical dimensions, not just one. And that these dimensions now form part of our understanding of what it means to violate those laws. I know some people deny that, but it's not, I think, unreasonable to assume it. I don't think this is the essence of law. I don't think there's a Platonic form of law. I think this is how things have developed for us. I don't know quite who us is here either, but we can perhaps talk about that in questions time. Well, a disagreement about amongst members of a legal constituency about the ethical dimensions of law, and especially about what it is morally to wrong somebody, encouraged the tendency already second nature to political and legal philosophers to seek accounts of what it means to be morally and legally answerable to one another that are highly general, abstracted from the historical and culturally contingent idioms of the different and sometimes competing elements of a common understanding. On the other hand, it's often the case that our sense of what it means for people to do and to suffer wrong is informed by idioms resistant to such abstraction, by film, literature, song, for example. Indeed, often when we hold someone answerable or call them to seriousness, when we're inclined to say, don't you understand what you're doing? What it means to suffer the kind of degradation you're causing this person? Often in such cases, our sense of what we mean by meaning, when we say, don't you understand what it means, in contexts like this, depends on the fact that we often appeal to art to render more perspicuous our fumbling attempts to elaborate what it means to do or to suffer wrong. And were it not for an implicit reliance on such elaborations of what it means to violate a person's rights, for example, especially the kind of rights we call inalienable, the bare appeal to rights would strike us as absurd. Imagine if at the moment of bitter remorse a rapist were to say, "My God, what have I done? I violated her human rights." And though the moral dimension of a crime is not its only ethical dimension, it's the primary one in this kind of case, and indeed in all cases where the concept of a violation is the first to come to mind, as it does when we think of rape, torture, and other forms of cruel and degrading treatment. Well, I spoke just now of the concept of violation as though there were only one such concept, but of course there are many. And one, though, is especially relevant to my topic. We live in times when it comes relatively easy to us to speak of the dignity of the person, or the dignity of humanity, dignity here taking a capital D, or the inalienable dignity of every human being. And I don't know quite how extensive that "we" is, to which I've just appealed, more as an invitation than a sociological generalization. But it's significant fact to note that those expressions appear in preambles to important instruments of international law, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention Against Torture and other forms of inhuman and degrading treatment, for example. And it's natural to take their role in those preambles as suggesting that they should inform, that these concepts should inform the ethical elaboration of what it would mean to torture somebody or to seriously violate their human rights. Cultures have existed in which there was not even a hint of an awareness of those ethical concepts. Ancient Greece, for example, Aristotle had no sense of it whatsoever, nor did Plato. Some now exist which regard them as absurd. Absurd to think that Saddam Hussein, for example, was owed a fair trial for his sake, rather than because it might place the integrity of the legal system on some slippery slope. Or, to put it from the perspective of one who believes it was owed to Saddam for his sake as a human being, one might say, only if he were tried in that spirit would the integrity of the system remain intact. And that an imperative so sublime as the one that requires us to respect the humanity of even those guilty of the foulest crimes, that it should show itself in ways as prosaic as observing courtroom procedure might seem paradoxical. It might make us complacent or forgetful of just how wondrous it is that humanity should ever have come to that affirmation. And in much of my work, I've tried to reclaim a sense of such wondrousness and to create the right conceptual backdrop against which it might again speak to us. Well, the world looks very different to people who believe that every human being possesses an inalienable dignity to which unconditional respect is owed than it does to those who do not believe it. They'll understand differently what it means to wrong someone, what it means for a person to be fully aware of that wrong, because it will give a distinctive content to the idea of a violation. And that will affect their understanding of what it is to see or to fail to see someone as fully human, and therefore what talk of a common humanity might come to. They'll understand differently most of the virtues and the vices of what compassion and love most truly are, or what empathy most truly is. The golden rule that one should always treat others as one would wish to be treated oneself, which many people take to be the basic precept of morality and to capture the essence of the biblical command to love one's neighbour, that too will be understood differently by those who believe that human beings possess inalienable dignity than by those who do not believe it. Well, I place expressions like inherent dignity, inalienable dignity, or just dignity with a big D, or perhaps another famous Kantian expression, to treat everybody as a mean, never to treat anybody merely as a means to one end, but always as an end in themselves. I take expressions like that as occupying a kind of middle point in conceptual territory that I want to explore this evening. And on one side of them are people who speak in ways that are steeped in a sense of the importance to our moral and political thought of our humanity and of different forms of human fellowship, as when, for example, we speak of a common humanity, or say that to do such and such would be to treat someone as less than fully human, or when we speak of the human family, or when in political context we speak, as the preambles to some human rights law do, of a brotherhood and a sisterhood and so on. These are ways of speaking whose resonances and tone derive from the richness of a natural language and the art made possible by it, language shaped by and shaping the lives of people. Their use and even philosophical reflection on the use, I'll argue later, is therefore in medias res, in the midst of things. And these middle terms mingle well with those ways of speaking that draw more obviously on the importance of the concept of the human to our moral thought, as is evident in the preambles to the Declaration of Human Rights and other instruments of international law that I cited earlier. But not only do they mingle well, there's a reason to think that the fact that they mingle so well is a significant part of the reason why they have acquired their undeniable rhetorical power. Well, on the other side in this territory, there are, more often than not, philosophers, theorists, usually natural law theorists or Kantians, who aspire to speak in a language intended to reveal their real cognitive content, the real cognitive content of expressions like inalienable dignity, for example, and therefore the proper basis of their authority, make that perspicuous to reason. In the Kantian tradition, which I think is the one that speaks most powerfully to us, I think the elaborations refer to rational agency and the kind of respect that is owed to it. And that tradition looks with suspicion, if not actual hostility, on the power of those middle terms like inalienable dignity or dignity with a big D, looks with suspicion on the power that they've achieved on account of their engagement with those more humane ways of speaking that express and celebrate human fellowship. And from the perspective of that tradition, that is the Kantian tradition, that power looks, as I said earlier, like mere rhetorical power in the pejorative sense of that expression. And Kant himself is a magnificent example of a philosopher who believes, as much of the mainstream of philosophy believes, that when we think about the great matters of morality and politics, the cognitive content of one's thought, the content that is strictly answerable to reason and to truth, should always be, in principle at least, extractable from the literary form of its presentation. And obviously this sets philosophy and art radically apart from one another. To reveal how common this philosophical aspiration is, and now comes the difficult bit for about five minutes, so hang on to your hats. It has to be. I feel this especially because I've just come back from writers' festivals, you know, where everybody talks about truth and memory, and I just feel like saying Philosophy 101 would not be a bad thing at these places. Anyway, so, even though, as you'll see from what I'm talking about, I spend much of my life talking to my philosophical colleagues about the importance of writers. And in fact, I'll tell you something. The other day I was teaching a class, an MA class, philosophy, and I thought, who here has heard of Helen Garner? About 35 students, one person. Who has heard of Alex Miller, for example? Nobody. And a few other names, nobody. So anyway, that's an aside. But to reveal how common the philosophical aspiration that is always to extract a certain kind of cognitive content from the form it takes, usually in some natural language or sometimes from music and so on, To see how common this is, how natural it comes to philosophers, I'll report a probably apocryphal anecdote that Bernard Williams relates in his essay, What Might Philosophy Become? It's an anecdote about two philosophers who are writing a book together. And one says to the other, let's first get the content right, and you can add the style later. Most readers will see the humour of it, I'm sure, but the depth and extensive relevance of the point may not be so evident. Williams's anecdote expresses very nicely an ideal that, as I've suggested, goes very deep in philosophy and also in other discursive traditions more generally, in our very concept of the discursive, in fact. And the philosophers in the story believe that style and cognitive content are always in principle separable. The book they're writing, in this case Williams's philosophers, is obviously philosophical, but the point can be generalised to anything that these very representative philosophers would accept as being genuinely cognitive, a matter for understanding rather than entertainment or edification. Style, they think, should be in the first instance the means to get cognitive content into other people's heads. And to achieve that, of course, it should be as plain and clear as possible, and one might strive for a little elegance, especially if that facilitates delivery of that content into other people's heads. But of course, trying to be literary can be dangerous, because it often betrays the head to the heart. And if only we could transfer cognitive content from one head into another by telepathy, that would be a really good thing. And neuroscientists, I'm sure, are working on it at the moment. Well, the interesting assumption that underlies this way of thinking about style and content is that when style is not merely aesthetic, when it's in any way an expression of the heart, of feeling, it endangers the work of the head. Style can appeal on this conception to our vulnerability to sentimentality or to pathos, for example, and when it does, it can distort cognitive content, which Williams's philosophers believe can always be characterised independently of the style in which it's expressed, and independently, indeed, of those psychological vulnerabilities that make us so liable to let our hearts rule our heads. And they think of sentimentality or a tendency to pathos and so on as causes that undermine cognitive achievement in much the same way as being drunk or tired or just having a splitting headache does when one tries to do mathematical calculations or when one's trying to become clear about some factual matter. Well, I gave mathematics and factual inquiry just then as examples because it's evident that the cognitive nature of any mathematical and purely factual content can be fully characterised without reference to the fact that we are creatures who are vulnerable to tiredness, headaches, drunkenness, and other maladies. That we are vulnerable beings, then, on this account, has no bearing on what it is for something to be a valid proof or on what it is for something to be a fact. The content that Williams's philosophers take to be genuinely cognitive content, content directed to knowledge and understanding, rather than entertainment or edification, is content to be extracted from its literary form or other forms and assessed in a style-free, tone-free zone, in which the objection that is sentimental or tone-deaf would be as relevant to logic, as irrelevant as lodging such an objection to propositions in mathematics or physics. And of course, that conception of the cognitive and the correlative ideal of how to come into possession of it would be of no interest whatsoever if it were restricted only to philosophers. But they're not, but it's not. And as I said earlier, it goes very deep in our Western tradition and influences much of what we say in public discussion about the baleful effects of the emotions on the work of reason. Well, against that position, I've argued in much of my work that if we're actually attentive to the role that admissions or accusations of sentimentality, and I'll just take sentimentality now as my example, if we attend to the role that plays in our assessment of how we've come to our beliefs, then sometimes we'll see it's not merely a cause of cognitive failure, a cause of the false, as I shall now put it, for the sake of simplicity, but it's also sometimes a form of the false. And when it's a form as well as a cause of the false, It distorts cognitive content that's of a kind that could not exist were we not vulnerable to it and like maladies. Poets strive often more fiercely than philosophers and scientists to ensure that their poetry is free of sentimentality. But if they were to wish themselves to be creatures free of a vulnerability to it, they'd wish themselves free of the only idiom in which they could write poetry. Discursive reflection cannot, of course, aspire to poetry, though it may sometimes be poetic, but the recognition that there are forms of understanding and thinking and reflection to which vulnerability to sentimentality is intrinsic, that recognition will reward us with a richer conception of the forms of the discursive. So I apologise for the philosophical density of this part of my lecture about the significance of that distinction as I've drawn it between sentimentality as a cause and sentimentality as a form of the false. But it's important when we're thinking, or when we're sometimes inclined to say that there should be a bit more head rather than heart, or perhaps the other way round. And obviously there are times when we're right to make such pleas, or to say that to someone who's being too emotional and that he or she should allow reason its voice. But what it means to do this, to say, oh, come on, you're being so emotional, why don't you be rational, why don't you think, for example? What that comes to will depend, or what one intends by it will depend on whether we agree with the assumptions about form and content made by Williams's philosophers and by so many people, or whether we reject it in favour of something like I've tried to sketch. And I've persisted in elaborating that distinction, even though I thought I might cut this part of the lecture, because it shows that when we think and talk about how we should live, then we are necessarily and inextricably, far more deeply in medias res, far more deeply in the midst of things than even most philosophers who acknowledge that language is inseparable from ways of living, Wittgensteinians and pragmatists, for example, would be happy with, it would make them uneasy. And it's for that reason that I would emphasise the importance to our understanding of the forms of the ethical, especially of morality, of the concept of a human being, rather than the concept of a person or a rational agent. It's why I place weight on a sense of a common humanity, rather than a constituency of persons or rational beings united by their principles, and that the relevant sense of a common humanity depends on seeing all the peoples of the earth, different though their cultures may be, as striving for lucidity about what it means to be a mortal being, defined by sexuality and at every moment vulnerable to misfortune. And I've called the cognitive realm in which head and heart, style and content are inseparable, I've called that the realm of meaning because it's where we discuss what it means to love or grieve truthfully and why it matters to be lucid about that, to be truthful in one's love and grief, and what it means to wrong someone and what it means to suffer a wrong. In short, it's where we elaborate questions about how to live and develop tentative or not so tentative answers to those questions. And the fact that the critical categories that determine its distinctive cognitive character, that is the distinctive cognitive character of what I'm calling the realm of meaning, the fact that those categories are also deployed in the assessment of literature indicates a thought in the realm of meaning should never wish to distance itself too much from the natural languages that nourish it. Well, some philosophers believe that in formulating his moral philosophy, as he did, focusing on the unconditional respect owed to human beings, considered as rational agents, that Kant tried to render perspicuous to reason the biblical command to love one's neighbour. Love can't be commanded, he said, but the imperatives of reason are justifiably thought of as commands. However, when a soberly remorseful person is awakened to the terribleness of what he's done and become through doing it, it strikes me as a parody to suggest that we could adequately capture the seriousness of that by saying that he'd failed to acknowledge or failed to see the implications of acknowledging that his victim is a rational being. The remorseful rapist, who I said earlier will not get far in understanding the moral terribleness of what he did if he thinks of it only as a violation of his victim's human rights, will certainly get no further if he thinks he violated her rational agency or failed fully to respect her as a rational agent. Wishing to soften the stern demands of reason, some philosophers would prefer to appeal instead to the notion of what is reasonable. But you'd have to be tone deaf to believe that someone who thinks Saddam should have been shot in the street like a rabid dog fails to be reasonable. Imagine saying to such a person, "Hey, be reasonable." What's reasonable is rather what is reasonable, though I think one shouldn't think it, but what is reasonable is to think that if you want to be treated like a human being, first you behave like one. Well, I'll try to make all this less abstract by discussing how we might understand the concept of genocide and the Holocaust in relation to that concept. It seems to me our understanding of the death camps of the Holocaust would be much poorer without the writings of Primo Levi. The literary quality of his writing is, I believe, essential to an understanding that Levi gives us. In my judgment, it's writing that shows up Elie Wiesel, even the Wiesel of his most famous book, Night, as given too often to sentimentality and posturing. Now, I don't ask you to agree with that judgment. I know that many of you won't, and that some of you might even find it offensive. But I ask you to consider whether the need to make that kind of judgment, deploying concepts that partly define a literary sensibility, might not be intrinsic to the kind of understanding that writers like Levi and Wiesel give us. I ask you in this case I'm inviting you to ask whether it's essential to the kind of understanding that they give us, that we need to judge whether we're moved by them when we're moved by them, only because we're prone to sentimentality or to pathos, or because perhaps we have a tin ear for irony, and so on. And why does that matter? Well, because I think if we do believe that it's necessary to make such judgments, then I think we should also believe that the kind of understanding that writers like Levi and Wiesel give us, the cognitive nature of the content that they deliver to us, to the understanding, can't be separated from its form, or broadly speaking, from its style. So, at any rate, I'm suggesting to you this evening, and to make that part of my case less abstract, I'll look at two works by Bernhard Schlink, a novelist and also a professor of legal philosophy. His best-selling novel, The Reader, won international acclaim and abuse in probably equal measure, and it was adapted to film of the same name starring Kate Winslet and Ralph Fiennes. How do you pronounce it? His more recent book, Guilt About the Past, was developed from lectures that he gave in Oxford and is a work of legal philosophy, though one in which the novelist is recognisably present. In Guilt About the Past, Schlink writes analytically about what had preoccupied him as a novelist when he wrote The Reader, collective responsibility as it burdened the second generation, as he puts it, of Germans who in the 1960s and 70s became fully aware of the political crimes and evils perpetrated by their parents and grandparents. The second generation defined itself by what it took to be its distinctive problem: how to respond clear-sightedly, politically and morally, to the discovery that someone you love or admire is guilty of the crimes of the Holocaust, or was, in one of its many possible ways, complicit in them. In The Reader, the issue of the second generation is dramatised by the relationship developed soon after the war between Hannah, a woman in her 30s, and Michael, who was very willingly seduced by her when he was 15, and who then fell passionately in love with her. The relation is described in considerable erotic detail, and though we have occasional misgivings about Hannah, she engages our sympathy. It's easy to see why Michael should fall in love with her and be haunted by her all her life, haunted by the memory in every detail of her physicality, undermining in one degree or another all his relationships with other women. During their relationship, she often asked him to read to her, a fact of great importance to the novel and differently perhaps to the film, but I'm not going to be concerned with that this evening. The affair ends when Hannah leaves without explanation or even a warning. Michael sees Hannah again only when, as a law student in the 60s, he attends a trial of minor war criminals. Hannah is amongst them. She was, he discovers, a guard at Auschwitz. She selected people for the gas chambers and sometimes took especially fragile young girls under her temporary care so that they would read to her, only to send them too to the gas chambers. When the Allies closed on Auschwitz, she became a guard on the infamous Death March. And during that time, together with her co-defendants, she refused to open a door to allow prisoners to escape from a bombed church, though they were burning alive in it. To have opened it, she claimed, would have been contrary to orders and would have caused chaos. She's accused of having written a report that would establish her primary responsibility for not releasing the prisoners. At first she denies that she wrote it, but later admits to it, untruthfully, it transpires, because she would prefer to suffer the penalty for that admission, rather than to admit that she could not have written the report because she's illiterate. Only Michael knows this, from Hannah's behaviour in court and from his recollection of events in their relationship that had previously baffled him. He infers Hannah cannot read or write. She's sentenced to life in prison. People have objected that in portraying Hannah sympathetically, Schlink distracts our attention from and perhaps even invites us to excuse the terribleness of her crimes. It's one thing, they say, to draw attention to the fact that not all evildoers are monsters. That we learned from Hannah Arendt's discussion of Eichmann. It's, however, another matter entirely intentionally to draw a character who engages our sympathies before and even at the time when we discover that she's deeply involved, if only as an ordinary German, in the crimes of the Holocaust. Arendt was probably right to say that Eichmann was no monster. I think it was Terence, the Roman dramatist, who said, "I am a man, nothing human is foreign to me." Some people who agree with this take it to mean that they see in themselves all the possibilities of good and evil. I don't believe them. Few people can truthfully see in themselves the real possibility of saintly action. And as for evil, I don't believe that someone who says that they know they now have it in them and that we must all acknowledge under pain of superficiality or self-deception that we all have it in us to do what Hannah did or Saddam did or Eichmann did. I don't believe them because I don't see real terror in their eyes when they say this or hear it in their voices. The terror would be there if they had discovered that in themselves and understood what it meant. What is true, however, I think, is that nobody can say, "I could never do such things." But that's different from thinking that if one searched truthfully within oneself, one would find something there from which such evil could issue. And in a similar way, I think it's false to say that there must be some good in everybody, though we may not be able to see it. But I do believe that we should fear ever to say that some people are beyond the reach of a sober remorse. That latter affirmation, though we should never say of anybody that they're beyond the reach of a sober remorse, that's not an empirical judgment. It's an affirmation that those who make it, those who would dare not refuse to make it, it's an affirmation and it's as groundless as it is wondrous. If we assert the former empirical claim that there is some good in everybody, if only we look hard enough to find it, and even if we don't find it today, it's still there. That affirmation, the empirical affirmation, if it's made repeatedly and if we don't find that good in people, may tempt us to give up that claim and to believe in the end, at the very best, that there are some people whose humanity we have no reason whatsoever to respect, and that if we treat them as though we had such a reason, it's only because we might fear the consequences of not doing so. I think it's right to say that we share, even with people like Eichmann or Saddam, a common humanity, and that they're owed justice simply because they're human beings. Moshe Landau, who was the presiding judge over the Eichmann trial and who was trained in a German jurisprudence and therefore a Kantian tradition of jurisprudence, he spoke in interviews of the inalienable dignity possessed by all human beings and to which we owe a respect that's unconditional. Respect owed to the human being as such, as Simone Weil put it, and admits of no degrees. But the idea of a common humanity, of what is owed to human beings as such, will not itself take us to the idea that every human being is owed unconditional respect because they possess inalienable dignity. To the contrary, to say that justice was owed to Eichmann because he was a human being is already to speak of humanity in a way that's ethically inflected by the idea of inalienable dignity. When Michael learns of Hannah's crimes, he tries to remember if there were things she had done, aspects of her character and personality that make it clear that she could indeed have done such terrible things, signs that he perhaps should have detected at the time of their love affair that would have shown that she had it in her to commit those crimes. And we, the readers, are inclined to demand of Schlink, the writer, that he give us those signs or fail as a novelist. We're inclined to think that there must be something that will explain why a person was able to do what Hannah did. We feel that we must be able to say that we were mistaken about her when she engaged our sympathies, not merely because we didn't know that she committed terrible crimes, but because we didn't know that aspects of her character and personality, we didn't know of them that enabled her to commit them. But the novel's most terrible lesson is, I believe, that it need not be as we so persistently think it must be. It's not just that we may not find anything in Hannah that would explain how she could do it. There may be nothing whatsoever that explains Hannah's behaviour in a way that would enable us to say justifiably that we were mistaken about her, as we would be justified if we discovered vices that we had not previously noticed. It's therefore not evasive or morally offensive to portray her as someone who should rightly have engaged our sympathies at the time of her affair with Michael. And if that's true of Hannah, who committed terrible crimes, it will be more evidently true of people who are guilty to varying degrees by omission rather than commission. Well, you may have noticed how naturally I spoke of the entanglement of Schlink's generation in the crimes of the Holocaust. I could have said that they were entangled in the crimes of the Hitler years or of the Third Reich. But to think of that period as defined by the crimes of the Holocaust, I mean that period of history as defined by the crimes of the Holocaust, is now second nature to us. It wasn't always so. Indeed, as Tony Judt, amongst others, has pointed out, when the genocide against the Jews and the Gypsies was carried out, and for some years afterwards, it mattered only to its victims. The dawning realisation in the 1960s in Germany and elsewhere of what really happened under the Third Reich had two aspects. The first could be revealed in film footage, in documents, and in the facts revealed in trials, and so on. Now, I'll call this knowledge of the facts, thinking of the concept of the facts in a very workaday sense, as a judge might use it when he says to an emotional witness, stick to the facts, please. So I'm thinking of facts in that simple workaday sense. But as well as learning more of the facts, people were trying also to understand the meaning of those facts. And it's important to remember, as I indicated at the beginning of this lectures, I mean everybody, not only the Germans, are still trying to understand this. We still argue about how to understand genocide and crimes against humanity. And we still argue about whether there is an aspect of the Holocaust that might be different from and worse than those crimes, and which perhaps no legal category can capture adequately. And to understand the meaning of those facts that are for the most part disputed only by Holocaust deniers, we turn to writers like Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Jean Amery, Hannah Arendt. And I now mention those writers because Michael found their books in Hannah's cell after she killed herself. The film, incidentally, doesn't tell us that. While in prison, she had taught herself to read. Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, was one of the first, and to my mind is still one of the most important works, to alert us to the importance, the moral, legal and political importance, of understanding why genocide is a crime different and more serious than mass murder, even when mass murder involves more victims, and why it should be called a crime against humanity. It's well known to anybody who followed the literature that it wasn't until the 60s that people began to understand that the Holocaust is a crime different from mass murder, even when there were many more victims, different in kind from the many mass murders of that blood-soaked century. Even many of its Jewish victims thought it differed only in its efficient brutality, the industrialization of death, as it's come to be called, from earlier pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, in which sometimes thousands were murdered. The concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity, with their inexpugnable moral dimensions, are inseparable from what we mean by the Holocaust, and therefore from our sense of its distinctive terribleness. Yet most of the people who committed those crimes did not understand what they did in terms of those concepts, whose significance we're still trying to fathom. There's probably more argument about the concept of genocide than any other legal category, which is quite extraordinary since it's been part of international law since the late 1940s. But there's still radical dispute about what genocide should be. So it's not an exaggeration to say we're still trying to understand this concept. And so in that case, in one sense of that morally complicated phrase, they did not know fully what they were doing. In one sense of that morally complicated phrase, though of course it's not a sense that would enable anybody to justifiably plead not guilty, in one sense of that phrase, the people who were guilty of genocide did not know what they were doing. The law will convict someone of genocide, of course, if the crimes they committed express the intention, as the Convention on Genocide says, and I quote, to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group as such. In her widely acclaimed book, Reading the Holocaust, a book that the New York Times judged to be the best book of 1999, the Australian historian Inga Kindinen asked, quote, is the guilt attaching to the intention to destroy a whole people different in kind from the intention to kill an equal number of individuals? Does the crime of genocide inhabit a moral category of its own? It's an important question, though Inga made no effort whatsoever to answer it. Many people have asked it when they contemplate the unnerving, even distasteful distance between the abstract nature of the concept, the many distinctions needed to delineate its structure, and the horrific details of the crimes to which it's applied. We feel the need to make clear what it is that makes genocide always a terrible crime, but the judicial and philosophical attempts to do so often seem so abstract, so far from anything that reveals to our sensibility the terribleness of what happened, that they can seem obscene beside the concrete, imaginatively vivid descriptions of mass murder. And it's those descriptions, often in the first person, in poetic language, or at any rate, the moving language of narrative, not the discursive language of conceptual or legal analysis, that seems to do the moral work of making us aware of what it means to have been victims of those crimes. When we've seen the corpses, the death camps, the chilling application of bureaucracy and technology, and when art has revealed to our moral faculties the true meaning of these things, do we not know all that's morally relevant to a full appreciation of what had happened during the Holocaust? Why, some people ask, was there so much intellectual fuss, so much argument and so much soul-searching about the nature of crimes against humanity, the name given by the Nuremberg judges to the crimes of the Holocaust, in order to distinguish them from war crimes and crimes against the peace. We know these same people say what the victims suffered. Would it have made a difference to their terror, their pain, their humiliation, if they'd known their murderers and tormentors were guilty of a crime against humanity and genocide? The rhetorical force of those questions is, I believe, undeniable. To respond adequately to them, however, we need to distinguish the quite general question of what it means for someone to do wrong or to suffer it from the specific question that Clendenin asked about genocide. And to explain why, I say I'll reflect briefly on a man, Jean Armory, whose book At the Mind's Limits, Contemplations by a Survivor of on Auschwitz and Its Realities. Michael also found that book in Hannah's cell. Armory, who was brutally tortured by the Gestapo, wrote that it was not the memory of the pain that he suffered that lacerated his soul throughout his life. It was the memory of the fact that human beings could do what they did to him, and that memory drove him to kill himself. When he was tormented by the question, how could they have done it, should we understand him to have been expressing his pained incredulity that anybody with even a small amount of the natural sympathy human beings have to one another in pain could do this? I don't think so. The natural psychological and physical pain that someone like Armory suffered at the hands of his torturers, together with the horrified incredulity that anybody could so radically be bereft of compassion that they could continue unrelentingly to torture someone, that and anything else of that kind can't take us to what rightly comes first to mind when people think about torture. Most people, when they think torture violates its victims. In his book, The Lesser Evil, Michael Ignatieff calls it the ultimate violation. Now, I've come here now to a very important point in the conceptual landscape that I've been trying to detail, and one that's easily missed if one yields to the almost irresistible inclination to think that the harms that are suffered by victims of torture are physical and psychological harms only, and that they could be described without reference to moral concepts, as they might present themselves, for example, to a compassion that exists prior to anybody's conception of morality, and which some people believe is in fact the primary source of our moral concepts. As well as suffering the most terrible physical and psychological harm, victims of torture also suffer the terrible evil of it, the evil of what is done to them, the terrible wrong of it, and that becomes for them a distinct and irreducible source of their torment. It's an element of their torment that can't be captured fully by elaboration on their physical and psychological suffering and their pained disbelief that anybody could be so untouched by natural human sympathy. That, I think, is essential to understanding why Armory said that someone who's tortured is never again at home in the world. Without wishing to make this a term of art, I'll say that the victims of wrongdoing generally, I'd make this point, not just about torture, suffer a harm sui generis. And I'll rephrase Clendenin's question to ask, if we try to elaborate the moral wrongs suffered by victims of the crime of genocide, is the concept of genocide essential to that elaboration? Surprisingly, the author of Guilt About the Past, the professor of legal philosophy, does not ask that question or any question like it, nor does he give any indication that he believes that it matters. We know that Hannah is guilty of, or at any rate participated in, crimes that defined the Holocaust. We also know, as I said earlier, that she read amongst others Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Jean Armory, and Hannah Arendt. To try to understand what she did, it was right that Hannah should read Primo Levi. Did she also need to read someone like Hannah Arendt? Or to put the question about Arendt another way, does it matter to Hannah's understanding of what she did and of Michael's understanding of what it means to have become morally entangled, for him to have become morally entangled with her crimes? Does it matter that she was guilty of genocide? The reader is, it seems to me, silent on this. And perhaps Schlink thought that because it's a novel, though a reflective novel, it would be unacceptably didactic even to pose such a question or provide materials for its answer. But if we put the same question to the legal philosopher, then we discover he's also silent, as I said. Guilt about the past does have a final chapter on fiction and the Holocaust, but it has nothing to say on what it means for our understanding of some of the big concepts of jurisprudence and international law. That what writers like Levy have to teach us depends on the literary quality of the writing. Depends, I would say, on the fact that their writing and our reflection on it is inescapably in the realm of meaning, as I characterized that before, necessarily answerable to critical concepts that define that realm as one in which style and content can't be separated. And that's why I said earlier that it's intrinsic to what Levy and Wiesel have to teach us that it should be appropriate for it to ask whether they yielded to temptation, to pathos, or to sentimentality, and so on. And that being so, it's intrinsic, as I said, to what they have to teach us, what they have to give to understanding, what they have cognitively to offer, that it not be even in principle separable from its style in order to be suited to assessment in a tone-free, style-free zone, in a zone where it would be as wrong-headed to ask whether it was undermined by sentimentality as it would, as I said before, to ask that of a proposition in physics or mathematics. Well, many of my friends who are writers find astonishing the suggestion that we need legal philosophy with its propensity to make many and fine distinctions, to tell us what is so morally terrible about what Hannah did. As I said before, they believe if we need the terribleness of what it is to commit and to suffer genocide to be vividly and soberly before our minds, they think it's art rather than philosophy that will do it. And when they ask me whether I agree, I answer with a yes and a no. Survivors of genocide who know the genocidal intentions of their persecutors suffer different and deeper trauma than those who have suffered mass murder only. People who are victims of genocide and the contempt that has been intrinsic to our paradigms of it suffer terrible natural harm, such as pain and fear, terrible evils such as murder, rape, torture. In addition, they suffer the distinctive evil of being treated as pollutants of the earth, as vermin, or as in other ways undeserving a place in the world. Worse still, some of them suffer the knowledge that their loved ones were the victims of that same contempt, and that conditions through and through the nature of their trauma. And that's true, I think, of all survivors of genocide. But survivors of the Holocaust also suffer the knowledge that the Holocaust originated in perhaps what people at the time thought to be the most civilized nation in Europe, and that other great European nations were in different ways accomplices to it. And that's different, I think, from the terrible pain that comes from knowing, as the Tutsis came to know some years later, that those same allegedly civilized nations and others abandoned them to their murderers. It's different, I think, because more than all other genocides and persecutions, the Holocaust destroyed or radically undermined in its victims a sense of being home in the community of nations and indeed in the world. And in fact, it destroyed in many of those people the very idea of a community of nations. Great artistry is needed to bring out the way this distinctive evil lacerates the soul. And because it's inseparable from an understanding of what the victims of the Holocaust suffered, it's inseparable from an understanding of what its perpetrators did, and therefore of what others who became entangled in it suffered and did. Primo Levi's If This Is Man is a work of great artistry in the sense that what it has to teach us about the meaning of the death camps is, as I said before, inseparable from the quality of Levy's writing. The Reader is not, I think, a great novel, but even so it reveals to us better, I think, than the discursive work of political or legal philosophy alone could do what it can mean to discover that someone you love is guilty of terrible crimes, even if it taught us nothing about what it means for those crimes to have been the crimes of the Holocaust. And because the novel is not directly about the Holocaust, my limited praise of it implies no perspective on the controversy about the place of fiction in depiction of the death camps. So that's the yes part of my answer to my literary friends. And now comes the no part. The power of narratives like Levy's to teach us about genocide, to reveal the distinctive character of what its victims suffered, depends, I believe, on our capacity to locate those narratives against the background of a common understanding, whose conceptual structure is one of the distinctive tasks of the discursive disciplines, and in this case especially of philosophy and legal philosophy. It's their distinctive task to elaborate that background and, if possible, make it perspicuous to us. It's the kind of legal philosophy I hoped Schlink would do in Guilt About the Past, philosophy in what I call the realm of meaning, written itself in an idiom in which form and content can't be separated. He didn't do it, but had he done so, his work would have been a fine illustration of the way that literature speaks to us only against a background of a shared understanding that is partly, but necessarily, constituted by other arts and by more discursive modes of thought and imagination. So we would have had in Schlink's case the novel, the film, and the philosopher. So even when it's reflective, as the reader is, art can't do that conceptual work alone. But legal philosophy and the other discursive disciplines that are relevant to it will do it well only when they're seriously responsive to art. And they'll be seriously responsive to art only when they abandon the belief that we must extract from the distinctive forms of art an intellectual content that can be delivered to a court of science and philosophy and other discursive disciplines before we can accept it with a good intellectual conscience. Without that conception of discursive thought, that's rendered distinctive by the way it's answerable to the critical concepts that define the distinctive cognitive realm in which thought and feeling, form and content are inseparable, without that conception of the discursive, we'll be, I think, bereft of an adequate sense of the subject matter of anything that might be called philosophical anthropology, which of course includes moral, political, and legal philosophy. To a heartbreaking degree, humanity has come to understand itself because of the crimes it has committed. It's therefore very important fully to understand the nature of those crimes and to give them their right names, to identify them under the right concepts. Genocide, as defined by the Convention, is universally acknowledged to be a crime against humanity. And just as it's a mistake to think that genocide is one of the gravest of the crimes against humanity, it can't be that, for example, if there can be genocide without a single murder. It can't be one of the gravest crimes. I mean, that can't be. Mass murders that are not genocides are obviously graver than that. So though it's a mistake to think the crimes against humanity, that genocide is one of the gravest of the crimes, sorry, must be one of the gravest of the crimes against humanity. So it's a mistake to think that crimes against humanity are always crimes so horrible that, as Jeffrey Robertson put it, they're unforgettable and unforgivable. The conceptual core of a crime against humanity, I suggest, is that these are crimes that should concern the citizens of all nations, insofar as they belong to a community of nations. But the idea of a community of nations will be empty unless it's the idea of a community constituted as such, constituted, that is, as a community, by the way its members are answerable to international law, insofar as that law is informed by a sense of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth. Crimes initiated by states that are informed by the belief that some people are not fit to inhabit the earth are crimes of concern, obviously, I would say, to all human beings for whom it matters that their political identity is partly formed by the fact that they belong to a community of nations. Well, it's a truism that if international law is to realise its ambitions to constitute the nations of the earth as a community of nations, it must express values that are in some sense universal. What kind of universality is presupposed in that truism? Well, it's natural and common to think, as I said right at the beginning of the lecture, that the universal values expressed in those laws are principles that can be abstracted from the cultures of the nations that are answerable to those principles. Those values, it's thought, and these values, this thought continues, could be and ideally should be expressed in a language that consciously prescinds from the local, historically conditioned associations and resonances of natural languages. But as I hope what I've said before suggests another way of thinking about universality. It's implicit in the idea that great literature potentially speaks to all the peoples of the earth, but only as translated from one natural language into another. Great literature often speaks to people of all kinds, at all times, and in all parts of the earth, but as I said, only translated from one natural language into another. And that's not because we've been unable to develop a single universal language, as some hope to do when they hope to establish Esperanto as that language. It's because that's the kind of universality that's appropriate to the content of great literature, content which often cannot be separated from its form, and whose form cannot be separated from the contingencies that have nourished particular cultures, particular ways of living, and particular natural languages. And in that kind of universality, we find, I believe, the right connection between universal law and a sense of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth. Our sense of what we have in common, the sense that people express in their hope that an understanding that we have what we have in common will diminish the wrongs we do to one another. That sense is not for the most part based on facts of the kind recorded in scientific books or encyclopedias. It's a sense acquired only in what I've called the realm of meaning, centred on our responses to the defining facts of the human condition, our mortality, our sexuality, and our vulnerability to misfortune. Thank you.